The greatest of all time conversation in football becomes very fascinating to me, and I do think that there is some real intrigue in this conversation when it comes to the quarterback position, because when you think about it, there isn't really a definitive way to say who is or isn't the best of all time. Football is such a team sport. That's what kind of makes it so fun in a lot of ways, and what makes these discussions so fun is it's really hard to prove one thing or the other. However, I have given it my best effort here in this video. So first, if we're talking about the greatest of all time, we have to define what makes someone the greatest of all time, right? Because there's several different criterias you could have. Some people's criteria for the greatest of all time is simply who's won the most, who's the biggest winner. Football's a team sport. Whoever wins the most, that's what matters. So those people would say Tom Brady and call it a day. I don't view it that way. I think that's a poor argument. I think that, obviously, you look at Dan Marino and Eli Manning. I think Marino was clearly the better quarterback, even though Eli Manning has 2 Super Bowl wins. I think most people understand that just because you have 7 Super Bowls doesn't, by itself mean you are the greatest of all time, although it could be an indicator that you're probably pretty good. Another criteria can be highest peak. How good were you at the best point in time? So, for example, if we're talking about quarterbacks, the 2 seasons you'd probably go to would be Dan Marino's 48 touchdown, 5,000 yard season back in 1984, when that was insane, to even think about, really, or Peyton Manning's 55 touchdown season, which is crazy. Again, even given now, that would still be crazy, and it happened not too long ago, but a few years ago. So if you're talking about highest peak, it'd probably be one of those 2 guys, but that is also not my criteria. I view it a little bit differently. For me, the greatest of all time is a simple conversation to have. It is simply, if I drafted player X and they would go on to have the same career as any player I could choose from. Let's say it's, the Pokemon, Ditto, right? If I could draft Ditto and he could morph into any career, which player would I want him to morph into? And so, of course, it would be a quarterback, because that's the most important position, but which quarterback? So I value longevity, but I only value longevity if you're going to be good for a long period of time. If you're going to, hang around and be, barely starting for 5 years, well, that means nothing to me, because I would rather have a different quarterback. I'd probably move off of you at that point. But if you're going to be a tier, 1 quarterback, a top 5 quarterback, or a top 10 quarterback for a long period of time, well, that matters more than someone who maybe had a better season for 1 year, but then not for an entire career. So then, how do you really measure this? What statistics do you use? It's tough because, on this channel, I like to use advanced statistics if I can. The issue is just that there's not a lot of advanced statistics that go back to the 50s, right? So I can't really use advanced statistics because there's 8 main guys I wanted to include on this list. 2 of them are older guys. You have Otto Graham and Johnny Unitas I wanted to include on this list, along with Joe Montana and Dan Marino, 2 guys who also, they played before Pro Football Focus existed. And then 4 guys who, we've all watched, if you're watching this channel, because I imagine most of you are young, although there's probably some who, watch some of those other guys as well. But, Aaron Rodgers, Peyton Manning, Drew Brees, and, of course, Tom Brady are the 4 other guys that I wanted to include. Those are the 8. And the statistic I decided to use a lot of this data on, although it's not going to be the end-all be-all, just to get some graphs together, is going to be passer rating. I do feel like passer rating as a whole is a pretty good stat. A comparison I'll use is in baseball. So they have the stat ERA, which goes back a while. And basically it's, in an average 9-inning game, how many runs would you have given up? And since then, they've come up with better statistics that can really narrow it down a little bit better and come up with better ways to view who is or isn't the best pitcher. But the reality is, typically ERA still tends to be pretty good at that. Typically ERA, you look at a pitcher and how many runs they've given up and how many innings they've pitched. That tends to be a great indicator in how good they are, even if there's maybe slightly better ways to view it. I view passer rating in a very similar sense. Yes, it's not perfect, and I would prefer a Pro Football Focus grade to passer rating, but we don't have that going back to some of these other guys. But when you look at passer rating, the reality is, it's a combination of how many yards you get per attempt while not turning the ball over. I would rather if they didn't have touchdowns included, but they do, so that's another factor. But, you look at how many yards per attempt you get without turning the ball over. That tends to be a pretty good indicator, along with completion percentage, of how good of a quarterback you are. So I think it's fair to use passer rating. The other, flip side comes in when you start talking about, well, you can't just look at passer rating by itself, right? Obviously, Aaron Rodgers is going to have a higher passer rating than Otto Graham, because they just play in different eras where passing is, so much easier now than it was 50 years ago or even further back than that. So instead of just looking at passer rating, I looked at where did you rank among the league in your average passer rating season. So basically what I mean is, if you had one season where you were 4th in passer rating and then one season where you were 8th in passer rating, your average passer rating ranking is 6. So here we go. First chart right here. So what you're going to see right here is Otto Graham had the highest, but it's worth mentioning there were a lot less players in the league back then. He was playing with, sometimes I did include, both leagues before the 50 merger, so that makes it a little bit more fair. But yeah, as a whole, he was top 3 on an average season. But again, we're talking less people, but still very impressive. Joe Montana is also very impressive, averaging 4.6, which is, a top 5 season every year he played. Again, pretty incredible there. And there were 28 teams when he was playing, so that's, almost what we're at now. Aaron Rodgers, another guy who has been incredible. And then you get guys who kind of drop off a little bit. These are all in one chunk. Peyton Manning at 6.9. Johnny Unitas falls down, which, Unitas, the numbers didn't do him a lot of justice, I don't think. And we're going to see that a little bit more. I wanted to include him because he's considered one of the GOATs. And he had a high peak, but he also had some valleys in his career. Again, Tom Brady at 7.3, Drew Brees at 7.4, and Dan Marino at 7.5. But, Marino might be the most interesting one there. But again, Marino's a guy who he had that 84 season, but he didn't necessarily stay at like a top 3 quarterback level for a long period of time the way that, Joe Montana did. So that's interesting to me that you have those numbers, but I should probably bring up the fact that there's a reason why some of these exist, and it's not necessarily perfect. So the real error I think this chart itself has, not that it's an error, but the flaw in this chart, and the reason why I'm going to continue looking at data and not just say, I guess we have our complete list of who the GOAT is the fact that just using where you average ranked can really throw things off. Someone like Peyton Manning was incredible except for really 2 seasons, his first season and his last season, and he would shoot way up in the rankings if you just took those off of his career. And obviously the value he brought to the teams he played for are still huge, even though he had, a bad rookie season, which you kind of expect, and a bad ending season, which you also kind of expect. A lot of the guys who, someone like Otto Graham, he went into the league, was great, and left while being great, so he never had those valleys that you typically have at the beginning of your career and at the ending of your career. Joe Montana is a guy who left maybe with some still in the tank because he left still playing well, and Aaron Rodgers, didn't start his first few years and also has not yet had the ending of his career, so that's where it gets a little bit tricky. Using just average doesn't really work. So instead, I decided to get a little bit weird with it, and I'm going to use some advanced data while still using passer ratings. So if you guys have followed this channel for a minute, I've talked about how I consider how valuable it is for a quarterback to have, a top 5 season, a tier 2 season, tier 3 season, tier 4 season, and tier 5 season. I've kind of quantified how many wins that typically gets you. So I decided to use that with all of these players. It's the same it's a war just in terms of where you rank in that season, how much wins that typically will get a team. How much wins, if you're the 3rd best quarterback, how many wins does that typically add to your team being the 3rd best quarterback? So it's not exactly exact because not all 3rd best quarterbacks in football are built the same. It still is pretty close. I also had to adjust it given, less teams in the league. So I kind of just, every category got shrunk, basically, is how that worked, but you could still earn the same amount of wins, even if you were playing in the 50s, which probably isn't, again, doesn't really logically make sense because you only play less games and stuff, but I didn't factor that in. I'm assuming everyone's playing 16 games, even though that's not actually true, just so that way no one gets an unfair advantage for playing more games. So right here is the total war, is what I'm calling it. Again, what it is, just in case that was confusing, because I know it's a lot, it's taking where you finished in passer rating and seeing if that's how good of a player you were, how many wins does that typically add to a team, and then I'm saying that you added that throughout the course of your career. So someone like Tom Brady has averaged, not averaged, but accumulated a total of 60 wins over the course of his career. Drew Brees just behind him, Peyton Manning just behind him. Then you get a little bit of a gap. Dan Marino, again, because he had that hot peak, he gets a little bit ahead of Montana. And, you see that the guys who have played longer are obviously going to accumulate more WAR. Rodgers hasn't played as long, so he's a little bit lower. Guys like Unitas and Graham also didn't play as long. Part of that was the era. Guys just didn't play as long back then as they do now. So how do you factor that in? I kind of think you can't. I kind of think you just have to say, well, it was going to be really difficult to be the greatest quarterback of all time in an era where you couldn't play quarterback that often. So it's time to make some decisions. It's time to make some cuts. I'm going to get rid of 4 guys right here that I just think, given my criteria, cannot be in the GOAT conversation. I'm going to get rid of Unitas, Graham, Montana, and Marino. It's not their faults. They played in a different era, but I just don't know how you can quantify that. So this is where getting into different eras becomes tricky, but from the way I see it, it kind of does make sense that the best quarterback of all time would play in the era where it's easiest to play quarterback. So if you disagree with it, that's fine, but I'm just going to get rid of those guys because I just think it's hard to really evaluate it from further, and you have to say, either you value who had the best, average WAR per season for their career, or who had the most accumulated WAR, or you can kind of go in both directions, but that's the way I'm doing it with there. However, it's not it for them. We're still going to talk about them, because now I do want to talk about, so we have how much WAR they accumulated. Well, let's look at how much WAR they on average had in a season. So if you had, if you added 50 wins and played 10 seasons, well, you on average gained 5 wins per season, which would be a ton, but just simple math, that's what we're doing. Let's look at where these players lined up. So you look at the top right here, Aaron Rodgers and Peyton Manning, very high up. What's interesting about this to me as well is, keep in mind, this is an average season. So Peyton Manning has his last season where he did not gain any WAR at all, and he still is just barely below Rodgers. It's, they're both 3.4. Rodgers was a better 3.4. You also have Joe Montana and Tom Brady slightly below those two guys, which is interesting because, again, the conversation is always Rodgers, Manning, Brady, who's better, and people typically say Brady, but if you look at an average WAR season, Brady is a little bit lower than them. However, I have more on that in a second. You also have Otto Graham, who goes a lot higher up now in this chart. Drew Brees and Dan Marino, still a very respectable over 3 WAR per season, which is, again, that's a crazy high number. Johnny Unitas at 2.7, the worst on this list, but still very good, I would say. While the Brady being a little bit lower than Manning and Rodgers is a bit surprising, I looked at Pro Football Focus, and it only goes back to like 2006. But if you go back there, Brady's average season is, in terms of a Pro Football Focus grade, which is more exact than passer rating, Brady's average season is 86.7. Rodgers' average season is 87.1. So it's 0.4 points better. So Rodgers, according to Pro Football Focus, slightly better than Brady. And using an average season there is actually a lot more exact than using an average season in like passer rating, where you ranked passer rating, because 134 completely throws that off when you're typically dealing with 5s and 7s, whereas Pro Football Focus grade, a 70 isn't going to do as much damage when you're dealing with 86 typically. Outliers just don't matter as much in that specific stat. So with that being said, I have a couple more cuts here. First, I am going to cut Drew Brees here, which it's tough because Drew Brees, if you look at total WAR, is second according to my calculations. The issue with Brees is I just have a really hard time seeing how you could value him over Tom Brady. It seems like everything Brees has done, Brady has done better. while Brees has played for a long time and played at a high level for a long time, Brady played at a slightly higher level and played for a slightly longer time. So it's hard to really, Brees is close, but Brady's just slightly better, I would say. The only way that I think you could really consider Brees the GOAT would be if you value passing yards per season, but not per attempt, and you don't value protecting the football as much, which that's not how I understand how football works. So Brees is cut here, but again, he's a legend. He's in the conversation for sure. I'm also going to cut Peyton Manning here. So we're going down to Tom Brady versus Aaron Rodgers. And again, this doesn't mean that those are the two best of all time. This just means those are the two easiest to make an argument for, I think. Because, Manning and Rodgers were right there. You could argue their careers have been equally as good, but Rodgers has potential to, play a lot longer than Manning has. So there's that. I actually think that you can make the argument over Manning over Rodgers pretty easily. I think the argument is, Manning has, as of right now, played longer, and he played at about equally as high of a level as Rodgers did. So that's the easy argument. Although I think really it comes down to, can Rodgers surpass Manning? I think so. And the real reason I want to do this is because it makes it a much more interesting argument, I think, when you do Rodgers versus Brady. In my opinion, Rodgers is the only guy who can pass Brady. And here's where things get very interesting. So first, let's talk about the postseason numbers. People love to bash Peyton Manning for this, but you look at their numbers, they actually all go down in the playoffs. Again, using passer rating, Peyton Manning, his average passer rating was 96.5. That was just his passer rating in the regular season. In the playoffs, 84.7. So drops a significant amount, drops about 9 points. Tom Brady's still drops, though. It's from 97.3 to 90.4. So, just under 7 points for Brady. Rodgers' drops the least, but it still does drop from 103.9 to 100.5. So his drops over 3 points as well. So everyone's does go down. To me, it's not a ledge to stand on to say, Brady's won more Super Bowls, because it's not like Brady's performing that much better in the playoffs than his counterparts. To me, the reason why I am going to, and listen, there is a bit of bias here, as I'm wearing a Buccaneers shirt. I am a Buccaneers fan, although I would mention I called Tom Brady the GOAT before he came to my team. So I think that proves it's not just biases here. I think the real reason I would say that Brady is better is I would actually say one season of Aaron Rodgers or Peyton Manning or even Joe Montana is better than one season of Tom Brady. I think that's fair. I just think we've gotten so many more seasons of Tom Brady. That's really what it's come down to. And it goes back to my initial criteria. I do value longevity if you played at a high level. Brady has played at such a high level that he's a top 4 quarterback in football, and he's done it for way longer than any of these other guys have. So it's kind of the equivalent of, I guess, a good way to explain this is, let's say Tom Brady says, hey, one more year and I'm out, okay? I'm going to finish this season and then bow out. And Russell Wilson is planning on playing for another 10 years. You would probably make the trade to get rid of Brady and bring on Russell Wilson if you could, even though if you believe Brady is the better quarterback right now, Russell Wilson has more years on him. And so, that's the logical argument there. And again, I want to be very clear. The difference between Brady and Rodgers is still very close for one season, especially when you factor in one of the things I talk about is how important a receiving core is. Brady hasn't had the best receiving cores over his career. He's had some good ones, but he's had his fair share of some rough ones. Rodgers has pretty much always had good receivers, so that definitely skews things, and I actually think there's a very real argument to say that the Pro Football Focus grade of them being nearly identical with Rodgers slightly ahead is probably more accurate than the passer rating grade. Because again, if we look at total WAR, so you're factoring in the amount of seasons played, Aaron Rodgers would need to have his average season for 5 seasons more than Tom Brady plays. That's where he's at right now, which is going to be difficult to do because he turns 38 in December. So during the season, he would already have to play until he's 43 to make this work. Plus, Tom Brady is still playing, so he would have to surpass Tom Brady in that regard. So, if Brady plays 2 more years, now Rodgers has to play till he's 45 as well. So that's just what makes things a lot more difficult, and I don't know if he can catch up It's possible, and if he does, well, then I'll change my opinion on it. I think that that's pretty fair. I just think as of right now, it's hard to argue anyone other than Brady because he's not only done it so well, he's done it for so long. I do think that some people might make the argument, well, if Rodgers didn't have to sit for as long as he did, then maybe Rodgers would have been considered the true GOAT because, he had to sit out for 3 seasons before playing. Well, first of all, I would say let's not forget Brady also had to sit out a season because, he didn't play till his second year either. So it's not 3 seasons, it's only 2 seasons. But then I would say if we're doing these ifs things, then Peyton Manning's probably the GOAT because if he never got those injuries that derailed his career towards the end of it, he probably plays longer as well and is able to have more success. If Otto Graham was playing in this era, he would have gotten his career extended. You can't really go on ifs. I think you have to just go on what did we actually see. To me, the greatest quarterback of all time can only be done if you play quarterback. So that's my viewpoint on it. But I think it's interesting. So again, remind me in 5 years, and maybe I'll have a difference of opinion with the Rodgers thing. As of right now, and again, these stats are a little bit wonky. It's less about being absolutely perfect with this stuff and more about just sort of explaining my viewpoint, and I use passer rating just as a baseline to do that. So I hope you guys enjoyed this video, kind of a fun one. Let me know in the comments below, who do you think is the GOAT quarterback? Always love hearing from you, and of course, as always, thanks for watching.